Tonight, we open the quiet pages of a story both whispered and wondered about for centuries. The private life of Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia, and the tale of her 22 lovers. Behind the glitter of the throne lay companionship. Secrecy, politics, and passion, woven together into the life of one of history's most powerful women. This will not be told as scandal. It will be told as history, slowly, gently, with the steady rhythm of time itself, so that you may listen, relax, and if you wish, drift off to sleep. Before we begin, I invite you to subscribe to The Boring Historian for more calm journeys into the past. And as you listen, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? So, take a deep breath. Let the world outside grow quiet. And let us step back into the court of Catherine the Great, where power and passion walked hand in hand. A young woman, not yet an empress. Not yet the formidable ruler history would later call Catherine the Great, steps out of a carriage into the frost of St. Petersburg. Her name is Sophia von Holtzerbst, a minor German princess, far from the small court of her childhood home, surrounded by vast palaces of pale stone and glittering windows. The Russian court into which she entered was cold in every sense, a place of formality, suspicion, and hidden power games. She was only 14 when she first came to Russia, summoned as a bride for the young heir Peter. She spoke no Russian. She understood little of the rituals of this foreign land, and yet she had been chosen, like a pawn placed carefully on a chessboard. Her mother urged her to adapt, to please, to survive. And so, Sophie became Catherine, converting to the Orthodox faith and burying the girl she once was. But no transformation could soften the life that awaited her. Peter, her husband, was awkward, indifferent, and more attached to toy soldiers and bottles of strong drink than to the wife placed beside him. Their marriage bed was not a place of closeness, but of silence. Catherine, young and eager to be loved, found herself alone in a palace filled with echoes. She wrote in her diary of the endless nights, the chill of the halls, the absence of warmth. And here, in this emptiness, the first cracks in her story began to form. History would later count 22 lovers, men who came and went from her life like chapters in a long novel. Some remained for years, others only for months. Some were powerful courtiers who would rise with her. Others were youthful companions who offered little more than tenderness in a world that offered her none. To outsiders, these were scandals, whispered in coffee houses and across the courts of Europe. But to Catherine herself, they were lifelines, fragments of affection in a life otherwise ruled by duty, loneliness, and unending watchfulness. When she looked upon her husband Peter, she saw not a partner, but a rival. He did not hide his disdain for her, nor his unfitness to rule. Catherine began to realize that if she were to endure, if she were to carve a place for herself in this cold empire, she would need not only allies but also companionship. And so, slowly, secretly, her life began to shift. The first lover's name is often left vague in the shadows of history. Some say he was a courtier who noticed her sadness. Others claim he was little more than a boy himself, offering her laughter in a world without it. What mattered most was not who he was, but what he represented. Catherine's first quiet rebellion against loneliness. She had been given a crown in waiting, but no warmth, so she took it where she could. It was dangerous, of course. The Russian court was filled with spies, with eyes behind curtains and ears pressed to keyholes. To be caught would have meant disgrace, perhaps even exile or worse. And yet Catherine was clever. Even as a young woman, she learned how to mask her feelings, how to hide behind a serene expression, how to let her heart beat in secret while her face showed nothing. The scandal, when whispered, was not shouted. It was murmured in corridors, passed between servants, carried in letters to foreign courts. A German princess, a bride of Russia, already seeking comfort outside her marriage. To some, it was shocking, but others it was inevitable. For Catherine herself, it was simply survival. And so the pattern of her life began, a marriage cold as ice, and a series of lovers who would bring her the warmth she craved. These were not only men of desire, but often men of consequence. Some would help her rise to power, some would shape Russian politics, and others would fade quietly, remembered only in diaries and rumors. But each would play a part in the long story of an empress whose heart was as restless as her ambition. Imagine, for a moment, the palace at night. The corridors are long and dim, lit by oil lamps that flicker against painted ceilings. Outside, the snow falls silently across the frozen river Neva. Catherine, wrapped in heavy furs, walks slowly back to her chambers, her footsteps echoing in the marble halls. She is alone, utterly alone. Her husband is elsewhere drunk, lost in games of soldiers. She sits by the fire, the crackle of flames the only sound in the vast empty room. And then softly, there is another presence. A man younger than her husband, kinder, attentive, someone who listens, someone who laughs with her, who warms her hands in his. In such a moment, Catherine's story begins to change. Not with fanfare, not with fireworks, but with the quiet choice to seek love where love could be found. This is how the tale of Catherine's 22 lovers begins. In whispers, in shadows, in the emptiness of a palace built for grandeur, but hollow with silence. It is not only a story of scandal, but of humanity, of a woman who longed for companionship in a world where power was cold and marriage gave her nothing. As we drift further into her life, each lover will appear like a figure in candlelight, stepping into her world, shaping her destiny, and then fading once more into the dark. Some will remain, some will vanish. But together, they will form the hidden rhythm of Catherine's reign. And so, the first whisper has been heard. The young bride has taken her first step into secrecy. Soon, the Empress will emerge. With her, the men who will walk beside her, not in history books written for children, but in the quiet corridors of her private world. Story is only just beginning. Before she was Catherine the Great, she was Sophie. Born in 1729 in the quiet town of Stettin, then part of the Kingdom of Prussia, now Szczecin in modern-day Poland, Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst entered the world not with the roar of cannons or the splendor of crowns, but with the modest life of a minor noble family. Her father, Christian August, was a Prussian general, a man more at home in barracks than in courtly halls. Her mother, Johanna Elizabeth, was ambitious, sharp, and restless, forever searching for ways to lift her family into higher circles of influence. The household in which Sophie grew up was comfortable, but far from luxurious. She lived in a provincial governor's residence, not a palace of grandeur. Yet even as a child, Sophie's world was filled with lessons that would later shape her into an empress. She was intelligent, curious, and endlessly observant. She absorbed languages easily, studied history with focus, and from a young age displayed an extraordinary gift for remembering detail. What she lacked in riches, she made up for in determination. Her mother often reminded her that their family's fortunes rested not on armies or wealth, but on clever marriages. Sophie, it was clear, would be her mother's most valuable asset. As a girl, Sophie was not considered conventionally beautiful. She was slim, sharp-featured, with piercing eyes that seemed always to notice more than she said aloud. But she had charm, a quiet grace, and an ability to listen with a focus that made others feel important. In the world of dynastic politics, where alliances were forged in parlors as much as on battlefields, these qualities were more powerful than beauty itself. By her early teens, Sophie had already begun to understand her role. She would marry well, not for love, but for advantage. Every word she spoke, every gesture she made, could be weighed and measured against the ambitions of her mother. And then, far to the east, a great opportunity appeared. In Russia, Empress Elizabeth, daughter of Peter the Great, sat upon the throne. She was unmarried and childless. The future of the dynasty rested upon her nephew, Peter of Holstein-Gottorp. This Peter was awkward, immature, and unpopular, but he was next in line for the crown, and he needed a bride. Elizabeth, ever mindful of politics, looked for a suitable match. She wanted someone who would be loyal, malleable, and willing to adapt fully to Russian life. The young Sophie, though from a modest principality, caught her attention. She was German-born, like Peter, but adaptable. More importantly, her mother had connections that reached into influential courts. When word came that Sophie might be chosen, her mother prepared her with relentless energy. She drilled her in etiquette, polished her French, and pressed upon her the need to charm, to win, to secure a place in Russia. It was not simply a marriage being arranged. It was a transformation. Sophie's own writings from these years show her awareness of what lay ahead. She was nervous, yet eager. She longed for something beyond the small, provincial life she had known. Yet she also understood that she was being sent into a world where failure would mean disgrace. And so, at the age of 14, Sophie left her home. She traveled across Europe, through cities and across rivers, until she reached the frozen lands of Russia. The journey was long, filled with snow and uncertainty, but also with the whispers of destiny. When she finally arrived in St. Petersburg in 1744, she stepped into a world utterly unlike her own. The Russian court was vast, glittering, and intimidating. Gold gilded the walls, chandeliers dripped with crystal, and courtiers moved like actors across a stage, each word calculated, each gesture rehearsed. Sophie knew she must adapt. Quickly, she learned Russian with astonishing speed, mastering the complex language in just a few months. She converted to the Orthodox faith, taking the name Ekaterina Alexeyevna Catherine. With this act, she shed her old identity and embraced her new life. But her new husband, Peter, was a disappointment. Mature, self-absorbed, and deeply uninterested in her, he seemed more like a sulky boy than a future czar. Catherine, for all her youth, was already more mature than he. She sensed the hollowness of their marriage from the very beginning. Yet she played her part with skill. She charmed Empress Elizabeth, who grew fond of her. She made allies among the courtiers. She smiled, she listened, and she hid her loneliness behind a mask of composure. Inside, however, Catherine began to feel the weight of her isolation. She had been plucked from a small town and placed into a palace of marble and gold. Yet the walls around her felt more like a prison than a paradise. She was expected to produce heirs, to remain loyal to a husband who ignored her, and to embody the dignity of a future empress. It was here in these early years that Catherine began to dream of something more. She read voraciously, filling her mind with philosophy, history, and ideas from the Enlightenment. She admired the works of Voltaire, Montesquieu, and other thinkers whose words spoke of reason, justice, and the nature of power. These ideas planted seeds within her, seeds that would later grow into the policies and reforms of her reign. But philosophy alone could not ease the ache of her private life. The marriage was cold, her husband distant. Catherine longed for affection, for companionship, for someone to see her not only as a pawn of politics but as a woman. And so the stage was set. Catherine, once Sophie, the young German princess, had entered the glittering but lonely world of the Russian court. She had taken on a new name, a new faith, a new destiny. Around her stretched endless corridors of marble, filled with secrets, rivalries, and dangers. Ahead of her lay a crown, but also the emptiness of a loveless marriage. It was in this emptiness that the story of her 22 lovers would soon take root. For Catherine, companionship was never merely pleasure. It was survival, comfort, and, at times, the very tool by which she secured her throne. From the little girl in Stettin to the young bride in St. Petersburg, her journey had only just begun. The whispers had not yet reached their loudest, the scandals not yet formed. But the girl who once played quietly in her father's halls was now at the center of Europe's greatest empire in waiting, and her private life as much as her public one would soon shape history itself. The German princess had become Catherine, and with each step, the shadows of her future companions grew nearer. Catherine's marriage to Peter was not the kind of story that poets sing of, or that storytellers paint in bright romantic colors. It was a union of politics, of dynastic necessity, of Russia's great chessboard of power. When Catherine, still so young, was joined to her cousin Peter, the hope of two nations rested on their shoulders. But beneath the golden crowns and endless ceremonies, there was no warmth, no spark, and no true meeting of hearts. Peter, the grandson of Peter the Great, had grown up in a different world. He was a boy who never quite became a man, fascinated with soldiers, toy regiments, and the mechanical rhythm of parades. He loved the trappings of war, but not the responsibilities of ruling. For Catherine, who longed for conversation, for culture, for partnership, this marriage quickly revealed itself to be a cold and lonely arrangement. The grand palaces of St. Petersburg became for her gilded prisons, their walls echoing with silence, broken only by the sounds of endless rituals and the emptiness of her husband's affections. The truth is that Peter was never interested in Catherine. He found her distant, or so he claimed, though it was he who pushed her away. He preferred to drink with his guards, to play with his toy soldiers late into the night, or to disappear into the company of women who were not his wife. His immaturity, his erratic temper, and his lack of attention left Catherine adrift. She was expected to bear heirs, to provide stability, to smile in public, while in private, she was often left alone in the cold halls of her chamber. Imagine for a moment the young woman's isolation, far from her family in Prussia, without a friend she could truly trust, surrounded by a foreign court that watched her every move with suspicion. Her husband did not comfort her. Her position at court was insecure, and yet she could not falter. Catherine learned to hide her disappointment behind grace, to smile even as her heart ached, to adapt and survive within the confines of this arranged life. It was in these lonely years that Catherine turned inward. She read, she studied, she sought the wisdom of philosophers, she filled the emptiness of her marriage with the strength of her own mind. But even the greatest mind longs for warmth, for companionship, for the closeness of another soul. And so, it was in the quiet of these loveless nights that Catherine began to look beyond her marriage. Not for fleeting distraction, but for something more essential: connection, affection, and perhaps the power to shape her destiny. It was this void, this absence of love, that opened the door to the whispered stories that would one day define her legend. The story of the 22 men who entered her life, not merely as lovers, but as figures who would change her fate. Each one, in their own way, filled a space that Peter could not. Each one carried her further down the path of power, passion, and survival. The world outside her chamber doors saw only the Empress, the perfect figure for display. But within, Catherine was still a young woman, longing for something more than cold alliances. And it was this yearning that set the stage for the secret story of her lovers. It's a story that would intertwine with the history of Russia itself. The marriage bed may have been cold, the throne may have been distant, and Catherine's heart, restless and searching, had only just begun to seek its companions. And so the tale moves forward into the first whispers of companionship, into the early shadows of a woman who would, through love and power alike, carve her own place in history. In the silence of Catherine's early years at court, the emptiness of her marriage pressed heavily upon her. The gilded halls of the Russian palaces were filled with watchful eyes and unspoken rules. Yet beneath the surface, life was as restless and human as anywhere else. Behind the polished doors and glittering chandeliers, men and women whispered, laughed, and sometimes dared to disobey the stern demands of propriety. It was in this fragile space between duty and desire that Catherine first stepped into the dangerous territory of intimacy outside her marriage. Her early affairs did not begin with grand passion or wild rebellion. They began with small gestures: a quiet conversation after a formal dinner, the brush of a hand against hers in a corridor, a moment of kindness when she felt most unseen. Catherine had been taught since girlhood that her purpose was to serve the state, to produce heirs, and to embody grace. But beneath the surface of duty, she was still a woman, young and unfulfilled. Aching for attention her husband refused to give. The first man to notice her in this way was not a prince or a general, but a courtier, a man whose role placed him close enough to her daily life that their paths crossed often. His name, whispered by historians, was Sergei Saltykov. To the world, he was unremarkable, just another young nobleman among many who filled the court. But to Catherine, he represented something vital: warmth where there had been only coldness, intimacy where there had been only distance. Their connection grew in secret, for to be discovered meant scandal, exile, even danger. Catherine moved carefully, cloaking her feelings in the formalities of the palace. But in quiet rooms, away from the endless ceremonies, something daring began to take shape. Saltykov offered her attention, gentle words, and the kind of affection she had long been denied. In his presence, she was not only the Grand Duchess, not only a pawn in Russia's dynastic game, she was a woman seen, a woman desired. It is easy to imagine the thrill and the fear of those first encounters. The palace walls seemed to have ears. Servants moved like shadows. Letters could be intercepted, and glances could be misinterpreted. Yet Catherine carried herself with remarkable composure. Even in her earliest affair, she showed the careful intelligence that would define her reign. She did not act recklessly. She acted with thought, with caution, balancing desire with the knowledge that she lived in a world where one misstep could mean ruin. Some historians have wondered whether this first affair was encouraged by those around her. After all, her marriage to Peter remained unconsummated for years, and the Empress Elizabeth, eager for an heir, grew impatient. In such a world, Catherine's intimacy with Saltykov may not have been entirely her own choice, but a necessity shaped by politics. The line between love, duty, and survival blurred. Whether driven by desire or by expectation, her first lover became the beginning of a long pattern in Catherine's life. Companions who offered her both personal comfort and political security. Saltykov was not only her first known lover, but also the man rumored to be the biological father of Catherine's first child. Whether or not this is true remains debated, but the whispers spread even in their own time. To the court, it mattered little who fathered the child. What mattered was that Catherine fulfilled her role as mother of a future heir. Yet for Catherine herself, this first affair was not just about politics. It was about survival in a cold marriage, about claiming a piece of her own life, when so much of it was controlled by others. The secrecy of these moments created a rhythm Catherine would come to know well. The thrill of being wanted, the danger of discovery, the balance between private longing and public duty. The palace corridors carried whispers, but Catherine learned to step carefully, to reveal nothing, to keep her secrets hidden behind calm eyes and measured words. This first lover was not the last, but he was the beginning. The moment Catherine realized she could create her own world of intimacy, even within the cage of politics and power. He was the first figure in a long procession of men who would walk beside her, each leaving their trace not only on her private life, but on the story of her reign. And so, in the soft shadows of secrecy, Catherine's legend began to take shape. The young bride, once trapped in a loveless marriage, had discovered a path of her own, a dangerous one, perhaps, but also a path that gave her strength, confidence, and the companionship she so deeply needed. The whispers of scandal had begun, and from this moment onward, they would never truly fade. For Catherine, love was never simply love, not in the Russian court, not under the constant gaze of rivals and spies, not in the shadow of an uncertain throne. Her private life, like her public one, was a careful dance, each step taken with purpose, each choice carrying consequence. The men who entered her life were more than fleeting passions. They were companions, protectors, and sometimes lifelines. In the ruthless world of imperial politics, where betrayal could come in a smile, and enemies lurked behind every gilded doorway, Catherine's lovers became her shield as much as her solace. From the very beginning, she understood the risks. An affair in the palace was not a game of youth. It was an act of survival. If discovered, she could be disgraced, cast aside, perhaps even imprisoned. Yet Catherine was never reckless. She chose carefully. She measured men not only by their charm, but by their usefulness, their loyalty, her ability to strengthen her position in a court where she was often surrounded by suspicion. Saltykov, her first known lover, gave her more than intimacy. He gave her confidence. His presence showed her that she could carve out a private space within the iron cage of her marriage. But as time passed, others would offer more: political advice, influence in court, even military strength. Each lover brought with him something unique, something Catherine could weave into the larger tapestry of her survival. Consider the palace itself, a place of endless eyes and ears. Every servant, every official, every lady-in-waiting was part of an invisible web of gossip. Secrets were currency, and scandal could be weaponized at any moment. In such a world, Catherine needed more than lovers. She needed allies she could trust when trust was rare. The men she welcomed into her life were often chosen as much for their loyalty as for their affection. Her affairs gave her more than comfort in the cold nights of an empty marriage. They gave her men willing to stand beside her when others would gladly see her fail. They whispered news of court intrigues, shared secrets overheard in the dark corners of palace halls, and offered advice when Catherine stood at crossroads. Some taught her how to navigate the tangled world of Russian politics. Others gave her courage to endure the relentless pressure of expectation. In time, Catherine's lovers became her quiet foundation. Each one, whether a nobleman or a soldier, formed a circle of protection around her fragile place in the Russian court. While Peter wasted his hours with his toy soldiers, Catherine built a hidden army of devotion. These men were her refuge, not only lovers, but advisors, companions, and in some cases, the very hands that would help secure her throne. It is tempting, even now, to see the story of Catherine's 22 lovers as scandal, as whispers of indulgence behind closed doors. Yet beneath the gossip lies a deeper truth. Catherine was a woman surviving in a hostile world, and she used what she had: her intelligence, her charm, her ability to inspire loyalty. To protect herself, love and survival became one and the same. Some of her lovers guided her toward power. Others stood by her in moments of danger when discovery might have meant ruin. And though each affair carried risk, Catherine bore it with a calm steadiness. She knew what she was doing. She understood the stakes, and she played her role with quiet mastery. To the outside world, she was still the Grand Duchess, the wife of Peter, the future Empress in waiting. But behind the walls of the palace, she was already building her network of trust and strength. Her lovers were not distractions. They were the companions who allowed her to endure, to grow, to survive. The world of Russian politics was as brutal as any battlefield. To live within it was to fight a constant war, not with armies and weapons, but with whispers, alliances, and secrets. Catherine's heart may have longed for affection, but her mind never forgot that survival came first. And so, she chose carefully, always aware that each relationship was more than romance. It was part of a larger story, a larger struggle, the slow, deliberate rise of a woman who would one day rule an empire. As the years unfolded, the pattern deepened. Catherine's private life and her public fate became inseparable. Love was no longer a luxury. It was a weapon, a shield, and sometimes the very ground beneath her feet. And in this way, Catherine the young bride, trapped in a loveless marriage, began to transform into Catherine the survivor, a woman who would use every part of her life, even her most secret moments, to shape the destiny that awaited her. By the time Catherine's path crossed with Grigory Orlov, she had already learned to survive within the Russian court. She had endured the coldness of Peter, the weight of suspicion, and the endless watchfulness of palace life. But with Orlov, the story of her lovers took on a different dimension. He was not just a companion in the quiet hours. He was a man whose presence would change the course of history. Grigory Orlov was a soldier, a man of strength and presence. Like the courtiers who whispered behind silken curtains, Orlov carried himself with the directness of the battlefield. He was handsome, tall, and confident, a figure who seemed almost out of place among the powdered wigs and jeweled uniforms of the palace. But it was not his appearance alone that drew Catherine. It was his loyalty, his boldness, his readiness to stand beside her not only in private, but also in the dangerous world of power and politics. By the mid-1760s, Peter III had inherited the Russian throne. His reign, however, was brief and uncertain. His erratic behavior, his open admiration for Prussia, and his neglect of Russian traditions made him deeply unpopular among nobles, soldiers, and even ordinary citizens. Catherine, once a lonely wife with little influence, had by then become a woman of determination. She had supporters at court, allies in the army, and the intelligence to see that the throne itself could be within her grasp. What she needed was a man with the courage to act, and in Grigory Orlov, she found exactly that. Their relationship began, as so many of Catherine's did, in secrecy. But unlike her earlier lovers, Orlov was no shadowy figure moving quietly through palace corridors. He was bold, willing to risk discovery, and soon became a central figure in Catherine's life. Along with his brothers, a family of soldiers who commanded loyalty within the army, Orlov began to weave the threads of a daring plan. It would not simply be an affair, it would be a revolution. Catherine trusted him. She trusted his strength, his ability to rally men, his willingness to stake everything on her future. Their intimacy was not only passion, but strategy, not only closeness, but conspiracy. In the quiet of her chambers, love and politics intertwined, as Catherine and Orlov spoke of what could be. They dreamed not just of survival, but of power. The coup unfolded in the summer of 1762, while Peter III distracted himself with parades and indulgences. Catherine, guided and supported by Orlov, moved swiftly. Soldiers loyal to the Orlov brothers rallied behind her. The clergy lent their blessing. Nobles, long disillusioned with Peter's rule, pledged their allegiance to Catherine. The palace, once a cage, became the stage of her ascension. On the morning of July 9th, Catherine rode to the Izmailovsky regiment barracks. Dressed in military uniform, her presence electrified the soldiers. They declared her empress on the spot, cheering her name, pledging their loyalty. It was not only her birthright or her marriage that placed her on the throne. It was her courage, her preparation, and the support of the man who stood at her side, Grigory Orlov. By that evening, the coup was complete. Peter, abandoned by nearly everyone, fled the capital. Days later, he was forced to abdicate. His reign had lasted only 6 months. Within a week, Catherine, the once foreign bride from Prussia, was crowned Catherine II, Empress of Russia. The palace whispered with shock. Some said it was scandalous, that a woman had seized power not through bloodline alone, but through the loyalty of her lover. Others admired her brilliance, her boldness, her ability to turn personal intimacy into political triumph. Whatever the opinion, the truth was clear. Catherine had risen higher than anyone could have imagined. At her side, Grigory Orlov had been essential. Their relationship continued after the coup. Catherine rewarded him with titles, lands, and honors. For years, he remained one of the most powerful men in her court. A reminder that her lovers were never merely private companions, but figures who shaped the destiny of an empire. Yet even this bond would fade with time. As Catherine grew into her role as empress, she outgrew Orlov. Just as she had outgrown the cold marriage that first bound her to Russia, but his place in her story could never be erased. Grigory Orlov was more than just a lover. He was the man who stood beside her when she seized her crown, the man whose boldness and loyalty made the impossible possible. Without him, her rise may have faltered. With him, she became empress, and so love and power intertwined again. Not gently, not quietly, but in the roar of a coup that changed Russia forever. With the crown now firmly upon her head, Catherine stood as Empress of Russia. The young bride who once felt trapped in cold corridors had transformed into one of the most powerful women in the world. Yet even as she claimed her throne, the private rhythms of her life continued, rhythms of intimacy, companionship, and the whispered presence of lovers who would walk beside her. What changed, now that she was empress, was the weight those relationships carried. Catherine's private life was no longer merely about affection or survival. It became entwined with politics, wealth, and the careful balancing act of power. The men who shared her bed were not hidden in shadows forever. Many of them emerged into the public eye, rewarded not only with her affection, but with titles, lands, and positions of influence. Her lovers were not merely companions of the night. They became figures of the state. Men whose fortunes rose in step with their closeness to the empress. In this way, Catherine's court began to echo with whispers. Some called her generous. Others accused her of indulgence. But Catherine was not careless. She understood that the men she chose could serve her in more ways than one. They provided loyalty where she could not always rely on nobles. They provided stability in a court where betrayal lurked behind smiles. They became part of her network of power, bound to her not only by passion, but by gratitude. Grigory Orlov himself was the first great example. After the coup that placed her on the throne, Catherine rewarded him handsomely. He received wealth, estates, and military rank. His brothers, too, were raised into positions of prominence. The Orlov family, once soldiers, became one of the most influential families in Russia, not simply because of their service, but because of their bond with Catherine. This pattern would repeat again and again. Each lover Catherine chose was elevated, his fortune tied to her favor. Some were given lands stretching across the empire. Others were granted titles that lifted them above their peers. Still others were rewarded with positions of authority: generals, governors, ministers, roles that extended their influence far beyond the walls of her chambers. To outsiders, it seemed scandalous. To those at court, it was a reminder that Catherine's power was both personal and political. She rewarded loyalty, and in doing so, she ensured that the men closest to her would never betray her. They had too much to lose, and yet Catherine's generosity was not blind. When her affection cooled, so too did the rewards. Some lovers, once powerful, found themselves quietly moved aside, their titles intact, but their influence fading. Others were dismissed with gifts, estates, pensions, the wealth to live comfortably, but no longer the ear of the Empress. Catherine was never cruel, but she was practical. She understood that the men who shared her life were temporary, their presence fleeting compared to the permanence of her throne. Her approach reveals something vital about Catherine's character. She was not reckless with passion, she was deliberate. She chose men not only for their charm or their youth, but for what they could bring to her life as Empress. Sometimes it was protection, sometimes advice, sometimes simply the comfort of being seen as a woman rather than as a ruler. And in return, she gave them security, wealth, and the chance to rise higher than they ever could have dreamed. It is here that the story of her 22 lovers becomes more than whispers of scandal. It becomes a story of politics, of how Catherine wove even her most private relationships into the larger fabric of her reign. Love became a tool of governance, passion became a currency, and the men who entered her life became living symbols of the way she bound loyalty to her person. Not all of these relationships were equal. Some burned brightly, full of affection and devotion. Others were cooler, practical, and short-lived. Yet all of them carried weight. For Catherine, there was no clear line between the personal and the political. In the court of the Empress, every bond mattered, every connection carried consequence. The world, of course, whispered. Pamphlets circulated. Foreign ambassadors reported home with wide-eyed stories of the Empress and her lovers. Some painted her as indulgent, uncontrolled. Yet when one looks closer, one sees not recklessness but strategy. Catherine was careful. She was giving, yes, but she was also cautious, ensuring that each man left her life still bound by gratitude, never by bitterness. In this balance, she preserved her throne. She ruled not as a woman distracted by passion, but as a sovereign who understood that even passion could be turned into politics. And so, Catherine's lovers were never only lovers. They were allies, supporters, and sometimes stepping stones in her great project, the transformation of Russia into a modern empire. Each one played a part in the story, each one leaving a trace not only in her private life, but in the history of the nation she ruled. Thus, the politics of passion became one of Catherine's quiet strengths. While her enemies plotted, while rivals whispered, she built a circle of men whose loyalty was bought not only with affection, but with prosperity. It was a system that worked, discreet, deliberate, and remarkably effective. And in this way, love and power remained intertwined in Catherine's life, as inseparable as shadow and light. As Catherine settled more securely upon the throne, her choice in companions began to reveal a pattern. The men who drifted through her private chambers were often not seasoned statesmen nor hardened warriors, but younger courtiers, men whose youth brought with it a certain vitality, a kind of energy that seemed to refresh. The Empress in her long years of rule, these young men were bold enough to catch her eye, yet pliant enough to bend beneath her will. For Catherine, the attraction was not only in their charm or their appearance, but in what they represented. They were a contrast to the aging courtiers of her court, to the gray, stoic faces who filled the councils and whispered behind heavy doors. The young lovers were light against the shadows of politics. It made her feel alive, vibrant, and connected not just to power, but to the softer side of human need: affection, tenderness, and simple companionship. Many of these courtiers were brought close through games of chance, conversations at banquets, or strolls in palace gardens. Their presence gave her something that her official duties could not: laughter, the comfort of whispered confidences, the warmth of touch. For Catherine, who had endured years of coldness in her marriage, such intimacy was more than a pleasure. It was a kind of healing. And yet, these affairs were never entirely free of politics. A young courtier might soon find himself gifted with an estate or quietly promoted in rank. Not only as a token of affection, but as a signal to others, loyalty to the Empress carried its rewards. Some stayed for months, others for years, but few lasted forever. Youth fades, and with it, their place by her side. Still, Catherine never seemed to tire of surrounding herself with the bright glow of youth. Her lovers became chapters in her story, each a fleeting presence, yet each leaving behind whispers in the palace corridors. It was said that to catch the Empress's gaze, even for a season, was to step briefly into the center of an empire's heart. And as her reign stretched on the list of names, these young courtiers, these companions of the night, began to grow longer, till it formed the scandal that history would forever attach to her throne. Among the many names whispered in connection with Catherine the Great, one shines brighter than all the rest: Grigory Potemkin. If her earlier affairs were fleeting sparks, Potemkin was the steady flame. He was not simply another young courtier swept up by the Empress's gaze. He was her equal in ambition, her match in intellect, and perhaps most of all, her companion in the long and lonely burden of ruling an empire. Potemkin's arrival in Catherine's life was different from those before him. He was not merely chosen for his youth or charm, though he had both in abundance. What struck Catherine most was his brilliance. He was a soldier, a statesman, and a dreamer of vast visions. When they first drew close, their intimacy was not confined to private rooms, but spilled into every corner of the Russian court. Together, they plotted reforms, imagined new conquests, and shaped the empire's future. Their bond was so deep that many whispered they had married in secret, a quiet union never formally recorded but believed by those closest to them. Whether that is true or not, one thing is certain: Potemkin held a place in Catherine's heart that no other man could claim. Their letters, filled with tenderness and longing, reveal a softer side to the Empress, a woman who craved affection as much as she commanded respect. And yet even their great love was not bound by the rules of convention. Potemkin himself arranged for other men to enter Catherine's life, when he could no longer be by her side. Some of her later lovers, in fact, were chosen and approved by him, as if he understood that her heart, though vast, was restless. Rather than breaking their bond, this strange arrangement seemed to strengthen it. Catherine and Potemkin remained tethered to each other until his death, their love evolving beyond passion into an enduring partnership. To Catherine, Potemkin was more than a lover. He was her most trusted advisor, her confidant, her mirror. Together they expanded Russia's borders, modernized its institutions, and left behind a legacy still felt centuries later. Among the 22 names, his stands apart. Not a fleeting courtier, not a passing indulgence, but the great love of her life. For all her titles, her victories, and her fame, Catherine's world was often one of silence. The vast halls of the Winter Palace gleamed with chandeliers, echoed with footsteps, and shone with treasures from across her empire. Yet when the ceremonies ended, when the ministers withdrew, and when the doors were shut, the great Empress found herself surrounded by stillness. Power, though dazzling, was also a kind of prison. To be Empress was to live behind layers of formality, to be watched always, and to be trusted rarely. Courtiers bowed, ambassadors praised, generals obeyed, yet few truly spoke to her as a woman. Catherine, for all her grandeur, carried the deep weight of loneliness. It was here in this solitude that her lovers stepped into her life. They were not simply diversions, nor mere indulgences. They were her answer to the silence. Each one, whether bold officer, witty nobleman, or shining young courtier, filled the empty spaces between state affairs and endless decrees. They reminded her that she was not just the ruler of millions, but a person with her own heart, her own longing. The lovers brought warmth where the palace was cold. They offered laughter when the council chamber was heavy with politics. They gave her a companion's ear, a partner's touch, and, at least for a while, the comfort of being seen. For Catherine, this was no small thing. Ruling had taken her far from the girl she once was, far from family, far from the comfort of kin. In their arms she found pieces of what duty had stripped away. And yet, even as these men eased her loneliness, the cycle never ended. They came and went. They were promoted, rewarded, then replaced. The emptiness always returned, lingering in the palace shadows. And so, Catherine's story, and the story of her 22 lovers, was not only about passion or power, it was about a woman who filled the silence of an empire with fleeting voices, each one leaving behind an echo in her long reign. Behind the gilded doors of the Winter Palace, beyond the great ballrooms and the council chambers, there existed another world, a private one. Tucked away from the eyes of courtiers and diplomats, these were Catherine's secret apartments, hidden corridors, guarded entrances, and carefully chosen servants ensured that what happened there was known only to a trusted few. It was here that Catherine allowed herself to step away from the heavy crown and endless ceremony. Here she was, not the all-powerful Empress, but a woman seeking companionship. The apartments were decorated with warmth rather than grandeur, designed to soothe rather than impress. Soft furnishings, quiet alcoves, and candlelit corners created a place where whispers could be shared without fear. In these rooms, her companions entered discreetly, escorted by loyal guards or hand-picked attendants. They came not as officials or courtiers, but as men invited into her most private sphere. The hidden apartments gave Catherine something her throne never could: the freedom to let her guard fall. If only for a few hours. Whispers about these chambers spread throughout the court. Some claimed secret staircases wound through the palace walls, passages used only for lovers. Others said her guards kept meticulous lists of who entered and left, ensuring the Empress's reputation could never be too easily destroyed. The truth remains half lost to history, yet the image of Catherine's private world still lingers, a place where love and secrecy intertwined. For Catherine, these hidden chambers were not simply about passion, they were about survival. The secrecy of her apartments shielded her from scandal, protected her from rivals, and allowed her to balance her private desires with the heavy demands of public rule. Without them, her story, and that of her 22 lovers, might never have been written. To be chosen as Catherine's companion was more than a matter of romance. It was, in many ways, a door to fortune. For the young men who entered her private world, affection and intimacy often went hand in hand with wealth, titles, and power. Their relationship with the Empress was never confined to the chambers of the Winter Palace. It extended into the politics of the empire itself. Those who won Catherine's favor often found themselves transformed almost overnight. A soldier of modest rank might suddenly command regiments. A courtier of little standing might be granted a vast estate, his family lifted into nobility. A young man barely known in St. Petersburg might, with one glance from the Empress, become the talk of the entire capital. To share Catherine's bed was to enter a circle of influence few could ever dream of. This was not mere generosity. Catherine understood the value of loyalty. By rewarding her lovers, she ensured their silence, their devotion, and their continued service. To betray her was unthinkable, for to lose her favor was to lose everything. The court quickly learned this truth. Jealous glances followed those who rose too quickly, and whispers spread about the price of her affection. But beneath the gossip lay a more practical reality. The Empress was building a network of men who, in one way or another, served her cause, yet these rewards carried a shadow. The same young man who today basked in her warmth might tomorrow find himself dismissed, replaced, or quietly sent away. States could be seized back, titles could vanish, and friends could become enemies. Catherine's generosity was vast, but so too was her ruthlessness when bonds broke or when the spark of passion faded. Still, many accepted the risk. To be Catherine's lover, even for a season, was to taste a kind of glory that few men of the Russian court could ever imagine. Their names were etched into the secret history of her reign, each one elevated by her favor, even if only briefly. For Catherine, giving such rewards was never simply indulgence, it was strategy, a way of weaving her personal life into the fabric of her empire. Her lovers became more than companions. They became extensions of her power, each bound to her not only by desire, but by gratitude and ambition. In this way, the Empress used love as she used armies, diplomacy, and reform, as a tool to strengthen her throne and secure her reign. And so the rewards of love, glittering as they were, came with both privilege and peril. To hold Catherine's heart was to hold the empire's gaze. If only until the next young man stepped into the secret apartments and the cycle began again. No matter how carefully Catherine tried to shield her private world, the walls of the palace were never entirely silent. Servants whispered, courtiers speculated. Ambassadors sent letters across Europe filled not only with news of treaties and battles, but with stories of the Empress's lovers. In Catherine's lifetime, her bedroom became nearly as famous as her throne. Whispers drifted from the Winter Palace to the salons of Paris, the coffee houses of London, and the courts of Vienna and Berlin. The image of Catherine as a powerful ruler was constantly tangled with rumors of her many companions. To some, she was a modern monarch, ruling with intelligence and vision. To others, she was the scandalous empress, incapable of restraint. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. These stories spread with a life of their own. Every new favorite was noted by foreign diplomats, who recorded his name and background as carefully as they recorded troop movements or royal decrees. Letters carried across borders painted Catherine not only as a leader of armies, but as a woman ruled by desire. Satirical pamphlets appeared in Europe, mocking her appetite for lovers, sometimes with cruelty, sometimes with admiration. The gossip grew because it fed a narrative Europe was eager to consume. A powerful woman was still a rarity in the 18th century. Male rulers could keep mistresses without shaking their reputations. But for Catherine, her passions became weapons against her. Critics used her private life to question her judgment, to paint her as unfit, to reduce her achievements to the company she kept at night. And yet Catherine herself seemed unbothered. While others whispered, she ruled. While the salons of Europe traded jokes at her expense, she expanded her empire, reformed its institutions, and strengthened her power. Her private life may have been the subject of endless gossip, but her grip on the throne was never loosened by it. Still, the rumors never stopped. They became more extravagant with every passing year, more scandalous the further they traveled from St. Petersburg. By the end of her life, the number of lovers attributed to her had multiplied wildly, with some claiming dozens upon dozens of names. Even long after her death, the gossip continued, growing into myths and legends that often drowned out the reality of the woman she truly was. For Catherine, the gossip was both a burden and a strange kind of shield. As Europe obsessed over her private choices, she quietly shaped the destiny of an empire. And so, the endless chatter, the whispers in gilded halls, and the laughter in foreign salons became part of her story, inseparable from her reign. As the years passed and Catherine grew older, her pattern of choosing younger companions became impossible to ignore. Catherine seemed to draw fresh energy from surrounding herself with youth. Her lovers became progressively younger, men who could have been her sons, and in some cases nearly her grandsons. This choice, natural to her, but startling to others, sparked endless fascination among the courtiers who observed her life from the shadows. To Catherine, these younger companions offered something that her ministers and advisors could not. They brought vitality into her presence, laughter into her evenings, and the kind of admiration that refreshed her spirit. She had carried the weight of the Russian throne for decades. Perhaps in their company, she reclaimed a measure of lightness, a reminder of life beyond decrees, wars, and reforms. These men represented renewal, proof that time had not dulled her influence nor her ability to inspire devotion. But in the corridors of the Winter Palace, tongues wagged. Older nobles shook their heads, whispering that such behavior was unbecoming of an empress. Courtiers traded glances, wondering how long each new favorite would last before another even younger man appeared. The scandal was not merely about her lovers themselves, but about the contrast they presented. A woman in her 50s, 60s, still commanding the affections of men half her age. To her enemies, it became a weapon. To her supporters, it was proof of her unmatched presence. Outside Russia, the fascination only grew. European observers, already eager to paint Catherine as scandalous, seized upon these relationships as evidence of her supposed excess. Pamphlets circulated, mocking her appetite for youth, while satirists sketched crude caricatures. And yet, beneath the ridicule, lay a hint of awe. For who else among the crowned heads of Europe could command such loyalty, such intimacy, even as the years advanced? For Catherine herself, the matter seemed simple. She was empress, and she would live as she chose. If younger men offered her joy, companionship, or distraction from the solitude of power, then why should she deny herself? To her, love was not confined by age, nor was desire diminished by years. She embraced life fully, even defiantly, against the expectations of her court and the judgment of history. And so the cycle continued. A young officer, a fresh-faced noble, a bright-eyed courtier. Each entered her world, each played his role, and each eventually gave way to another. The pattern became part of her legend, shaping the story of Catherine the Great as much as her battles, her reforms, or her expansion of empire. To the courtiers, it was scandal. To Europe, it was gossip. But to Catherine, it was life. Her way of filling the silence of the throne with warmth, laughter, and the fleeting brilliance of youth. For all the whispers, for all the scandals, Catherine never forgot the delicate balance that ruled her life. She was not simply a woman indulging in private passions. She was the sovereign of the largest empire in the world. Every choice she made in secret threatened to echo in the halls of power. And yet, remarkably, she managed it, carefully, cleverly, always maintaining her image as a strong and commanding ruler. Catherine understood better than most that perception was as powerful as armies. She had come to the throne not by inheritance, but through a coup. Her legitimacy, though strengthened by decades of rule, was never beyond question. Enemies at home and abroad would gladly seize upon any weakness. To let her private life consume her public authority would have been dangerous. And so she wove a veil, not of cloth, but of reputation. Behind it, she lived as she pleased, while before it, she remained every inch the sovereign. This required strategy as much as statecraft. Her lovers were rewarded, yes, but they were also managed. When a companion's presence threatened to spark too much gossip, he was quietly dismissed with titles and land, his loyalty secured. When rumors reached a fever pitch, Catherine responded not with denial, but with indifference. She carried herself with such confidence that even scandal seemed powerless against her. If the Empress herself was unshaken, then who in Russia dared to challenge her? Her mastery of this balance was extraordinary. To the world, she projected the image of an enlightened monarch, a patron of the arts, correspondent of philosophers, a leader who expanded Russia's borders and modernized its society. Behind closed doors, she allowed herself the freedom of desire, the company of men who softened the loneliness of rule. The two worlds rarely collided, because Catherine never allowed them to. This ability to separate the public from the private was perhaps one of her greatest strengths. She understood that a ruler could not be wholly transparent. Some parts of life had to remain hidden, not out of shame, but out of necessity. In Catherine's case, the veil protected both her throne and her heart. Of course, Europe still gossiped. Caricatures were drawn, pamphlets circulated, and tales grew more lurid with each retelling. But none of it truly damaged her rule. If anything, the constant fascination with her private life only added to her legend. Catherine the Great was not a ruler easily ignored. She commanded attention, whether through diplomacy, conquest, or rumor, and so power remained firmly in her grasp. Behind the veil, she lived as she chose. For the veil, she reigned as few ever had. In this way, Catherine proved that her private desires and her public authority did not weaken one another. Instead, they coexisted, bound together in the story of a woman who refused to be less than both sovereign and human. As the years drew on and Catherine entered the later stages of her reign, her life remained as full of contrasts as ever. Outwardly, she was the Empress in command of an empire that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, celebrated as one of Europe's great monarchs. Inwardly, she was a woman growing older, her health beginning to falter, her body reminding her of time's steady march. Yet even then, she did not retreat into solitude. She continued to surround herself with companions, younger men who offered warmth, diversion, the reassurance that she was never truly alone. Her final lovers were much like those who had come before, youthful, handsome, often drawn from the circles of officers and courtiers. They were chosen not only for their appearance, but also for their willingness to please and to comfort the Empress in her later years. While passion may not have burned with the same intensity as in her youth, the need for companionship, for laughter, for affection, for the touch of another, never dimmed. Catherine, who had endured a loveless marriage and decades of whispered gossip, still craved closeness, still sought to ease the silence of the vast palace halls. To those outside her inner circle, these relationships were yet more fodder for gossip. The image of an aging empress with much younger men fueled caricatures across Europe. Her detractors used these stories as weapons, mocking her as weak, excessive, or foolish. But those who saw her closely knew otherwise. These men were not merely indulgences. They were part of how Catherine coped with the loneliness of absolute power. Even as her health declined, she maintained a sense of vitality through their presence. One of her last known favorites was Platon Zubov, a young man more than 40 years her junior. He was charming, eager, and easily shaped by her attention. To the court, his rise was meteoric. A sudden transformation from obscure officer to one of the most powerful figures in Russia. To Catherine, he was simply another in a long line of companions, who kept her world from becoming too cold. Zubov, like others before him, was richly rewarded, showered with gifts and honors. And yet, behind all the gossip and the satire, there was something deeply human in Catherine's final relationships. Age had not diminished her need for closeness. Power had not erased her longing for intimacy. Till her final days, she refused to let her position strip her of her humanity. As her reign neared its end, Catherine's legacy was already secure. Her reforms, her wars, her cultural achievements. But in the quiet hours of her private life, she was still the woman who sought love, invited youth into her aging world, who would not surrender to the solitude of the crown. Her final lovers were less about scandal and more about continuity, proof that even as her health declined, her desire to live fully remained undimmed. On the morning of November 17, 1796, the long and extraordinary reign of Catherine the Great came to its end. For more than 3 decades, she had ruled Russia with unmatched energy, reshaping it into one of the great powers of Europe. But in the final hours of her life, all the wealth, all the victories, and all the whispers of scandal faded into silence. Catherine collapsed in her palace, stricken by a stroke, and never regained consciousness. By evening, the Empress who had once seemed larger than life was gone. The news of her death swept through St. Petersburg like a shockwave. Courtiers, ministers, and guards all felt the weight of the moment. For some there was grief. For others, quiet relief. And for still others, uncertainty about the future. Her son Paul, long resentful of his mother's reign, prepared to take the throne. With him would come changes, reversals, and the unraveling of much that Catherine had built. But beyond the political drama lay another quieter story, the fate of those who had shared her private life. Catherine's lovers, both recent and long forgotten, found themselves suddenly exposed. Some who had enjoyed her generosity and protection were cast aside by the new ruler, stripped of influence or forced into exile. Others, such as Platon Zubov, her last favorite, clung to their fortunes, but could not escape the scorn that came with them. The privileges of intimacy vanished the moment Catherine's life ended. In the salons of Europe, her death did little to silence the endless gossip. If anything, it fueled it further. Pamphlets, satires, and scandalous tales poured forth, some rooted in truth, many invented from whole cloth. Stories of her lovers multiplied until the real number, 22 known companions, was buried beneath a mountain of exaggeration. Even in death, Catherine's private life remained a subject of fascination, as though her humanity were inseparable from her crown. And yet the woman herself slipped into history. She was no longer the empress pacing the gilded halls of the Winter Palace, no longer the figure writing letters to Voltaire or plotting reforms with Potemkin. She became instead a legend, remembered both for her greatness and for her passions. Her death was not only the close of a reign, but the sealing of her story, one that would be retold in countless forms, both fair and unfair, for centuries to come. For those who had once held her hand, shared her bed, or whispered to her in secret apartments, life after Catherine was never the same. Their fortunes rose and fell with hers, and when she was gone, so too was the world they had known. The empress who had filled the silence of her palaces with laughter, conversation, companionship left behind only echoes, memories of power, of love, and of scandal that would never fade, When we look back on the life of Catherine the Great, it is easy to become lost in the sensational. The rumors, the lists of lovers, the gossip that drifted from the salons of Paris to the coffee houses of London. To her enemies, she was scandal embodied. To her admirers, she was brilliance made flesh. Yet behind the grand facades of palaces and the glittering crown of the Russian Empire, Catherine was also something far simpler and far more human. A woman who longed for connection in a world where trust was scarce, and where the cold corridors of power could be unbearably lonely. Her lovers were not merely figures of gossip. They were fragments of her humanity. Some, like Grigory Orlov, gave her courage in the hours when the throne was not yet hers. Others, like Potemkin, offered partnership as much as passion, their bond outlasting the fleeting seasons of court intrigue. And still others, often younger, gave her vitality, warmth, and the comfort of companionship in a life burdened by duty. Each man, whether remembered with honor or derision, played a role in softening the sharp edges of power, reminding Catherine that even an empress was still human, still in need of affection. Power, for Catherine, was a crown of iron as much as gold. It demanded sacrifices, it isolated, and it cast her into a realm where few could ever truly understand her. The lovers who walked beside her, even briefly, were not merely rewarded with titles or estates. They were entrusted with the hidden part of her being, the part the world was never meant to see. That, perhaps, was the greatest gift she offered, the unguarded Catherine, stripped of ceremony, who could laugh, sigh, and love like any other soul. History has not always been kind to her memory. Too often the woman has been lost beneath the legend, her humanity reduced to scandalous tales. But if we listen closely, beyond the noise of gossip and the exaggerations of her detractors, we find a story both richer and more tender. Catherine's loves were not signs of weakness, but of resilience, a refusal to let loneliness consume her. A reminder that the heart, even in a palace of marble and gold, beats with the same longing as any peasant in a village cottage. So Catherine's story ends not in scandal, but in quiet reflection. She was a ruler of unmatched strength, a reformer, a visionary, and yes, a lover, a woman who dared to embrace her desires in a world that judged her for it. Perhaps that is her truest legacy, not the number of lovers she took, but the courage she showed in allowing herself to feel, to connect, and to live fully, even beneath the crushing weight of empire. Now, as we close this journey through her life, let us leave behind the gossip, the rumors, the endless speculation. Let us remember Catherine as a woman of strength and longing, of power and vulnerability, of brilliance and humanity. And as the halls of her palaces grow still, and the voices of her companions fade into the past, we whisper only this: good night, Catherine. May your story rest in peace, as we too drift gently into sleep.